Um, have you ever had a moment where you look back and thought, why didn't I pay attention to that sooner? Not in a dramatic way, just quietly. A birthday you missed, a phone call you meant to return. Something small, but now it stays with you. Most people don't realize what really matters until the clock has almost run out, and by then it's not the things they did that haunt them, it's the things they kept postponing, assuming there would always be more time. I've seen it. I felt it. And if you're open to it, I'd like to share what I've learned, not as advice, but as a reflection. Because time moves quietly until it doesn't. Time is one of those things we think we understand until we don't. It's this quiet, invisible force just moving, and you only start noticing it when something slips through. A birthday you missed, a call you meant to return, or someone retiring, and you realize you never really knew them beyond what they did. I remember watching one of our most senior engineers at SpaceX pack up his desk. He'd been there for over a decade, worked on the early Falcon prototypes. Meticulous guy. Almost obsessive about margins. And when I asked him what he was going to do next, he just sort of laughed, not in a joyful way, more like a soft exhale, like he realized something too late. He said, I spent 20 years building things I'll never visit, and ignored people I'll never get back. Then, he picked up a photo of his daughter from the desk. She was about 5 in the picture. She was 23 now. That stuck with me because here was a guy who had helped us reach orbit, something few people ever achieve. And yet, when the countdown hit 0 on his career, it wasn't the rocket launches he remembered, it was what he missed. I think about that moment a lot, not because I want to romanticize regret, but because I've seen a pattern over and over. Highly capable people, engineers, founders, investors, they all reach a point where the spreadsheets, the launches, the big product wins, they start to blur, and what comes into focus is something they didn't plan for. See, humans aren't built for long-term thinking, not naturally. We evolved to survive winters, not to reflect on what our 800-year-old selves might wish we'd done differently. So, we build these lives, these systems, these goals, and we postpone the things that can't be measured easily. We assume someday we'll be waiting, but someday doesn't wait. It quietly passes. It's in the unread email from your mom. It's in the friend you keep saying you'll catch up with after this quarter. It's in the guitar gathering dust, the hike you never take, the stories your grandfather never told because you didn't ask. And it's not dramatic. It's not a Hollywood moment where everything falls apart. It's a quiet erosion, a kind of forgetting. The truth is, most people don't realize what matters until they can no longer do anything about it. Not because they're foolish, but because they were focused, efficient, optimizing for performance, not permanence. That engineer wasn't a failure. He was brilliant, but brilliance doesn't shield you from misalignment. And it made me wonder, what else are we ignoring until it's too late? I was once asked a question that at the time I thought was too abstract to be useful. It was during the PayPal days, very early. A mentor of mine, a quiet man who rarely gave advice, looked at me after a long meeting and said, Elon, when all this is over, what will you leave behind that actually matters? I shrugged it off. I thought he meant legacy, like in the grand historical sense. You know, people naming buildings after you or writing biographies. I didn't care about that. I still don't really. But over time, that question changed shape. It became less about what I'd be remembered for and more about what I was actually building beneath the surface. Not the code or the company, but the stuff people don't see, the human layer. During Zip 2, I was obsessed with uptime, optimization, getting ahead. We were sleeping under our desks, literally. There's this one memory that surfaces now and then. My brother Kimball and I had just closed a small investment round, and instead of celebrating, I went straight back to debugging the back-end routing system. I barely acknowledged the moment, didn't call our mom, didn't even look up from the screen. At the time, it felt like discipline. Now, I think it was a kind of blindness, because the parts I remember most from those years, they're not the code, they're the laughs with Kimball at 3 a.m. eating cold pizza. They're the rare walks outside when the servers weren't crashing. It wasn't the product that stayed with me. It was the moments around the product. And that's what people don't tell you about legacy. It's not something you aim at. It's something that quietly accumulates in the shadows of what you think is important. I've spoken with people, engineers, artists, teachers who are nearing the end of their careers. And not one of them said, I wish I'd built more features. They said, I wish I'd told my wife I was proud of her, or I wish I hadn't waited so long to teach my son what I knew. We often design our lives the way we design systems, lean, efficient, scalable, but meaning doesn't scale. You can't mass-reduce presence. In some ways, I started realizing I had optimized my outputs, but not my imprint. I was good at building rockets, but I wasn't sure what kind of trail I was leaving in the sky, and so I began to pay attention to the smaller, quieter metrics. Not stock prices, not project deadlines, but whether I was actually showing up for people. Because legacy, it turns out, is what happens when your presence becomes a memory in someone else's mind. It's not what you leave on paper, it's what you leave in people. And that realization, it made me start questioning all the ways I had bought into the myth of later. It's strange how often we say, "I'll do it later," like it's a solid thing, like later is the shelf we can place moments on, trusting they'll still be fresh when we finally return. But time doesn't work that way. It doesn't pause. It decays what we store. I remember a moment, one of those days where everything felt urgent. We were prepping for a product reveal, the Model S. I think the whole team was stretched thin. Everyone was exhausted, and the pressure was intense. That morning I got a message. My son had his science fair at school. He built a small solar-powered motor, and he was excited, really excited. I told him I'd try to make it, but when the hour came, I was deep in a presentation rehearsal, trying to fix a timing issue in the demo. I looked at my watch, I hesitated, and then I told myself, I'll see the next one. There wasn't a next one. That might sound small to some people, but it wasn't small to him. And years later, when I asked him what he remembered most from that age, he didn't mention the car we launched. He said, "You always busy, Dad, but I wanted to show you something." That hit harder than most failures I've had, and because it wasn't a technical bug, it was a failure of attention. See, later is a seductive lie. It lets us defer what's fragile, what's real. We assume relationships, dreams, even our own health. They'll wait. They almost never do. In engineering, when you're given a deadline that can't move like a launch window, you build differently. You prioritize, you simplify, you make trade-offs with full awareness of what really matters. But life doesn't always announce its constraints. It just closes doors behind us quietly, one by one. I've talked to a lot of older people, investors, scientists, even a retired NASA astronaut, and there's this one thing they'll circle back to. They thought they had more time, not just to achieve things, but to be the kind of person they imagined they'd become. One guy told me, I spent 40 years climbing a ladder, and when I got to the top, I realized it was leaning against the wrong wall. That's what the myth of later does. It gives you the illusion of progress while stealing the meaning beneath it. So I started asking myself, if my time was suddenly cut in half, if I only had 5 more years, not 50, what would change? And the answers, they weren't about scaling companies. They were about how I designed my day, who I spoke to, what I noticed, which led to a deeper question. What if I stopped treating life like a product and started designing it with the same care I gave to machines? When we design a rocket, there's no part too small to matter. Every gram is considered, every wire, every seal you build, knowing the consequences of neglect are absolute. It either flies or it doesn't. But I wasn't designing my life that way. Not for a long time. It was more like I was iterating through chaos, reactive, always optimizing the next launch, the next breakthrough, and assuming that somewhere in all of that, a meaningful life would just emerge. It doesn't. I started realizing that I'd spent decades designing things. Cars, rockets, AI interfaces, and I'd applied more attention to airflow dynamics than to the structure of a single quiet evening. It sounds almost funny now, except it's not. I remember working on the Tesla Roadster, the early days. We were obsessed with getting the weight down. Every ounce counted. We redesigned the battery housing 5 times to gain efficiency. And we debated for hours over whether a curved edge improved aerodynamics by a fractional percent. But didn't spend that kind of focus thinking about my own systems, how I structured a week, who I allowed into my mental space, whether I was allocating any bandwidth to just being a person. It was like I was running a simulation with no user interface. And the thing is, this is common. I've seen so many people, especially high performers, treat their work with precision and their lives with assumption, assuming things will balance themselves, that meaning will catch up later, that burnout is just part of the price, but it's not a sustainable design. And the people who are most honest about that are usually the ones past the point of redesign. Seniors who look back and realize they invested their best energy in things that didn't remember them back. I think about that sometimes, how the most critical systems we operate aren't made of metal or code. They're made of attention, intention, memory. There's a kind of architecture to meaning. It's not flashy. It doesn't announce itself, but it's there in how you start your mornings, in the tone you use with people you love, in the things you make time for when no one's watching. I've started to treat my time a bit more like I treat spacecraft, fuel finite high stakes, worth tracking, because the truth is a well-designed life isn't about maximizing throughput. It's about aligning effort with what actually matters. That's a shift I didn't make until later than I'd like to admit. And even once I saw it, I had to confront the part of life I'd optimized the least, the part that doesn't scale, the part that disappears quietly when neglected, relationships. There's a kind of silence that accumulates between people. Doesn't happen suddenly. It's gradual, like static bowling on a line you never bother to clear. I used to think staying connected meant being reachable. My phone was always on. I responded to emails at 3 a.m. I thought that counted. But responsiveness is not the same as presence, and presence doesn't scale. I remember one week in particular, we were deep in a critical design sprint, trying to fix a vibration issue in the Raptor engine, sleep-deprived, focused, completely inside the problem. My mom called. She had just come back from a trip in Namibia, I think, and she wanted to share something about our family history. It wasn't urgent. So I let it go to voicemail. Then another call a few days later. Same thing. I told myself I'd call her over the weekend. The weekend came and went. When I finally picked up, her voice had shifted. Still warm but quieter, less eager. She said, "I figured you were busy, so I stopped trying." That hit me, because she wasn't wrong. I was busy, but I hadn't realized how often I'd let the people I loved become background noise. It's easy to justify when the mission feels massive, colonizing Mars, transitioning the world to sustainable energy, but meaning doesn't work on a scoreboard. It works in quiet rooms, in shared meals, in being remembered as someone who made time even when they didn't have it. I've spoken to people near the end of their lives, quiet conversations, nothing recorded, and they almost never regret work. They regret who they stopped calling, who they didn't forgive, what they assumed they'd always have time to repair. One man told me, "I lost my best friend over something neither of us can remember now, and by the time I was ready to call, he wasn't around to pick up." That line stayed with me, because we don't think of relationships as systems. We think they're self-healing, but they're not. They're fragile. They require energy input, like any complex structure, and neglect is a form of erosion, slow, quiet, irreversible past a certain point. I started thinking about attention like signal processing. In engineering, we filter out noise to hear what matters. But in life, sometimes the real signal is the one we treat like noise. A small text from a sibling, a hesitant conversation with your kid, a lingering look from someone who just wants you to ask how they're doing. Those signals don't ping loudly. They don't interrupt your calendar. They just fade if you let them. And I had let too many of them fade. You can't automate presence. And I tried through scheduling, delegation, even guilt, but it doesn't work like that. Eventually, I realized I needed to build a new kind of system, one that didn't rely on constant motion, one that required stillness. I used to be uncomfortable with silence, not literal silence machines. Come screens glow, engines roar, but the internal kind, the kind where no one needs you, no one is waiting, and there's nothing demanding your attention. For years, I filled every gap with motion. If I wasn't building, I was planning. If I wasn't planning, I was debugging something external, something internal. It didn't matter. Stillness felt inefficient, like a dead zone in the system. But what I didn't realize was that stillness isn't the absence of signal. It's the condition for hearing one. There was a trip I took years ago after a particularly painful failure. It was right after a SpaceX launch had ended in a fireball over the ocean. It was public, embarrassing, expensive. Everyone wanted answers, engineers, investors, the press, but I couldn't give them anything yet because I didn't have any clarity myself. So I left alone. I flew to Norway, just needed space. I remember walking near a fjord, snow on the ground, no phone service. For the first time in months, there was nothing to solve, no problem to react to, just cold air, and the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the ice. And in that stillness, I felt something strange, not peace, exactly, more like recalibration. It reminded me of how in physics, a chaotic system will stabilize once the external forces stop interfering. It finds equilibrium if you let it. Most of us never let our minds do that. We mistake motion for meaning, but without stillness you never get signal clarity. You just chase echoes. I started making small changes after that trip. Nothing dramatic. I'd sit alone for 15 minutes in the morning before opening a screen. Sometimes I'd go outside at night and just look up. No objectives, no thinking about launch windows or battery constraints, just silence. And sometimes an insight would land. Not always, but often enough to notice. Seniors talk about this too. I've heard them say they wish they'd spent more time just being, not accomplishing, not performing, just being present in their own experience. It sounds simple. It's not. Stillness is a skill set. And like any skill, it takes repetition. It takes discomfort. You have to override that instinct that says do something, because sometimes what matters most isn't what you do, it's what you notice. And what I noticed in that stillness was that I'd been investing energy into the wrong bandwidth. I'd been paying attention but not in the right places. And that's what I started to reframe next. The currency of attention. People think of time as the most valuable thing, but it's not. It's attention. Time is passive. You can waste it without even noticing. But attention, that's active. It's where your mind lives. And where your mind lives, your life follows. I didn't fully understand this until I found myself sitting in a room with my kids physically there, mentally elsewhere. Emails bouncing in my head, the supply chain delay, a board meeting I needed to prep for. They were talking about something, school projects, I think, and I nodded at the right times, smiled, but I wasn't really there. And then one of them asked, "Are you listening or are you just nodding?" That question still echoes because they were right. I was splitting myself across too many planes, giving slivers of my mind to everything and my full self to nothing. I've met people in their 70s who talk about attention the same way they talk about lost wealth. They say things like, "I spent too much of my life watching other people live theirs," or "I gave the best years of my focus to things that didn't deserve it." And I get that now, because attention is how we say this matters, and we say it whether we mean to or not. When you spend 3 hours scrolling and 10 minutes with your partner, your life is making a statement, and that statement is not neutral. And there's a term in physics, energy follows the path of least resistance. Attention, I think, follows the path of least intention. It drifts unless you anchor it. I started treating my attention like I treat battery consumption on a spacecraft. You monitor it. You prioritize essential systems. You shut down what's draining power without purpose. It sounds rigid, but it's actually freeing, because when you reclaim attention, you reclaim choice. And that's something most people don't realize until later in life. That attention was their only real freedom. Not money, not status, not time, just what they allowed their mind to hold. I think about that during conversations now. If someone's talking to me, I try to be all there, not as a performance, but because that's the only way to make something real. And when I look back, the moments that feel true, the ones that last, are the ones where attention wasn't divided. It was full, focused, undistracted. That's what makes memory stick. That's what makes presence felt. That's what makes a moment become part of a life. So the question I started asking wasn't, where is my time going? It was, where is my mind going when I'm supposed to be here? And that question led me to something even more confronting. You can't outsource meaning. There was a period in my life where I tried to delegate almost everything, not just business operations. Those made sense, but parts of my personal world too. I had assistants scheduling birthday gifts, people replying to messages on my behalf. Someone even once offered to handle my personal relationships, so I could stay focused on the mission. It sounded logical. Free up bandwidth, maximize output, optimize life, like it's a machine. But there's a flaw in that approach, because meaning isn't something you can automate. You can't assign someone to care for you. You can't hire a person to feel your absence in a room.